Africa is a continent full of beauty, culture, and immense potential. Yet despite all its natural riches, it remains one of the poorest regions in the world. How did this happen? Today, we will explore the reasons behind this paradox, how Europe's actions over centuries, and how Africa's own leadership has kept the continent from realizing its full potential. Let us rewind a bit. Africa, the cradle of humanity, was once home to thriving civilizations, bustling trade routes, and immense natural wealth. But by the 19th century, all of that changed. You see, by the time European powers gathered in Berlin in 1884 to carve up Africa, they were driven by one primary motivation: greed. At the Berlin Conference, not a single African leader was invited. Instead, Europe decided, over maps and handshakes, who would control what, treating the continent as if it were a cake to be sliced and served. The result? A continent divided by arbitrary borders without regard to ethnic, cultural, and linguistic realities. Many African countries were left with borders that cut through ethnic groups, splitting communities that had lived together for centuries and forcing different groups, sometimes with historical animosities, to coexist within newly formed states. Take, for example, the case of Sudan. The borders drawn by the British created a country that included both predominantly Muslim Arabs in the north and largely Christian and animist African communities in the south. The vast cultural and religious differences between these groups led to decades of civil war, which ended with the secession of South Sudan in 2011. Even after the separation, both Sudan and South Sudan still suffer internal conflicts, majorly tied to the legacy of these colonial borders. But borders were not the only problem. The same European colonizers systematically extracted wealth from Africa, shipping it off to build empires in the West while leaving Africa with little to show for it. Gold, diamonds, oil was plundered, fueling Europe's industrial revolution while leaving Africa impoverished. Infrastructure was developed primarily to facilitate the extraction and export of these resources to European markets. This exploitation extended to people as well, with millions of Africans forced into slavery, their labor stolen to build the prosperity of distant lands. A good example is the Congo Free State under King Leopold II of Belgium. His regime in the Congo was notoriously brutal, with forced labor being used to extract rubber and ivory. The locals were subjected to horrific abuses, mutilation, and killings. A lot of wealth was generated from this exploitation, but not to the benefit of the Congolese. Instead, it was channeled to Belgium, financing Leopold's grand architectural projects in Brussels. By the time the Congo gained independence, the country had little in terms of a functioning economy, with its people considered among the poorest in the world. This was despite Congo being one of the richest places on Earth in terms of natural resources. Similarly, in South Africa, the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in the late 19th century and gold in the Witwatersrand region soon after led to a rush of European settlers and investors eager to capitalize on these resources. The British, who controlled the region, established a mining economy that enriched a small white elite and foreign investors. Black laborers slaved here under very inhumane conditions. Profits generated from these industries fueled the industrial growth in Britain, but did little to uplift the local African population. Even after the end of apartheid, the legacy of this exploitation continues to affect South Africa, where wealth remains concentrated in the hands of a few, and inequality is among the highest in the world. The exploitation wasn't just economic, it was also psychological. European colonizers imposed their languages, their religions, and their cultures often at the expense of local traditions and governance systems. They justified this by promoting the idea that European civilization was superior and used pseudoscience and racist ideologies to legitimize that domination. This erasure of African identity left a negative imprint on the continent, an imprint that still affects governance, social structures, and even self-perception in many African countries today. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, Africa begins to shake off the yoke of colonial rule. Independence movements swept across the continent, and by the 1960s, many African nations had achieved political freedom. However, the damage was already done. The colonial powers, in their retreat, left behind economies that were designed to serve European interests, not African development. Existing infrastructure was minimal. Education systems were weak, and newly independent nations were left with little capacity to govern effectively. Many countries, eager to build their economies, turned to international lenders for financial support. However, these loans came with stringent conditions. Borrowing countries had to implement austerity measures, such as public spending cuts on essential services like healthcare and education. This diverted resources away from critical investments in human capital and economic development. Eventually, this debt burden became a significant obstacle to progress. As countries continued to borrow more to cover existing debts and fund necessary infrastructure projects, they found themselves deep in debt. This situation was severely worsened by mismanagement and fluctuations in global commodity prices, which made it difficult for resource-dependent African economies to generate consistent revenue. Notable examples include Ghana, the first African country to gain independence in 1957. Ghana faced economic challenges as it sought to industrialize and borrowed heavily to finance industrial projects and infrastructure development. However, by the 1970s, Ghana's economy was in crisis due to mismanagement, falling cocoa prices, and high levels of debt. The country was forced to turn to the IMF for assistance, leading to the implementation of austerity measures that further strained the economy. Zambia too gained independence from Britain in 1964 and inherited an economy heavily dependent on copper exports. The government borrowed extensively to finance infrastructure projects. However, falling copper prices drastically reduced government revenues, making it difficult to service their debt. By the 1980s, Zambia was heavily indebted, and the government had to implement austerity measures as part of a structural adjustment program imposed by the lenders.
One significant factor that has always held down Africa's progress is poor governance. Corruption is Africa's undeclared pandemic. In many countries, leaders prioritize their personal enrichment over the good of their citizens. Funds meant for public services, such as schools and hospitals, were siphoned off for private gain. This widespread corruption not only deprived the population of essential services, but also entrenched poverty, making it increasingly difficult for people to improve their living conditions. Jean Bedel Bokassa, who ruled the Central African Republic from 1966 to 1979, was one of Africa's most notorious leaders who used his position for personal gain. In 1977, Bokassa declared himself emperor in an extremely extravagant coronation, diverting significant public funds for the event. The coronation reportedly cost an estimated $20 million, a huge sum for a country whose citizens were deeply impoverished. Bokassa's regime left the Central African Republic poor and destabilized. Nigeria's Sani Abacha's regime is often cited as a classic example of kleptocracy in Africa's post-independence era. Abacha, a military dictator, is reported to have stolen billions of dollars from Nigeria's public funds, which he deposited in foreign bank accounts. His corrupt rule severely weakened Nigeria's economy and led to widespread poverty, despite the country's rich oil reserves. Another leader, Teodoro Obiang, the long-serving president of Equatorial Guinea, has been accused of embezzling state funds and amassing enormous personal wealth. Despite Equatorial Guinea's vast oil wealth, the majority of its population lives in poverty.
In Equatorial Guinea, going to a hospital is in fact signing your own death sentence. My sister had a complication with a pregnancy and she died at the hospital, bled to death because there was no doctor in sight.
Teodorin Obiang, who serves as vice president, has faced legal action in multiple countries for corruption and money laundering. In 2017, a French court convicted Teodorin of embezzlement and seized millions of dollars worth of assets, including a Paris mansion and luxury cars.
The French court valued his assets in France at around 100 million euros, including a large property bought for 25 million euros in Paris. The French public prosecutor has asked for a 3-year jail sentence, a 30 million euro fine, and all of Teddy's assets in France to be seized. The vice president denies the charges.
Okay, good. Over the last 50 years, Africa is estimated to have lost in excess of $1 trillion in illicit financial flows. these drained amounts far outweigh the development assistance going into the same countries. This is devastating, as it would provide much-needed capital essential to achieving economic development and poverty alleviation goals. All is not gloomy, though. While some nations have struggled, others have made incredible progress. One example is Rwanda, which has seen remarkable economic growth over the past 2 decades. Guided by its Vision 2020 development plan, the country aimed to transition from a low-income to a middle-income nation. By 2020, Rwanda had made substantial progress, with per capita income increasing from $206 to $850 over 2 decades. The national poverty rate dropped from 58.9% to 38.2%, thanks to the government's emphasis on inclusive growth and social protection initiatives. The country also made significant investments in healthcare and education, helping it achieve near universal health insurance coverage and almost near universal primary school enrollment. These successes show that it is indeed possible to overcome the challenges and create a brighter future. Africa has the potential to rise and thrive. The continent is home to a wealth of natural resources, a young and dynamic population, and a number of rapidly growing economies. These factors present enormous potential to rise and thrive. The challenge now is to harness this potential in a way that benefits all its people, rather than just a privileged few. This will require strong, transparent governance, investment in human capital, and inclusive economic policies that prioritize sustainable development. When Africa succeeds, it will lift up the entire world.
I think we must take responsibility and accept our failures in dealing with these matters. African leaders, we don't need to be invited anywhere to go and address our problems without first inviting ourselves to come together to tell each other the actual truth that we must tell each other about our serious problems.